Hello, my name is Alice Rothschild, and I should be on the main screen at this point. Rachel, your face is on the main screen. You want to fix that? So I am on the steering committee of Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council, and we are very happy to be here today. Almost 200 people have registered, and I hope a good proportion of people will come. We are receiving tech support with Rachel Rubin, who is on the steering committee of the Health Advisory Council, and Blake Pruitt, who is a wonderful social media counsel. So I just want to welcome everyone to our 18th Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council webinar. We do a webinar every 3 months. And just to let you know, the next one will be on September 18th. It's a weekend. It's being done at 10 a.m. Pacific time because we have speakers from Palestine, so it'll be evening for them. And we're going to have representatives from the Union of Agricultural Workers Committee, Adamir, and Al-Haq, which are 3 of the 6 organizations that were designated as terrorist organizations by the Israeli government. And they're going to give an update, which should be really informative, and also talk about the unfolding implications for human rights work in Palestine. After this webinar, you will all receive a survey, and we do look forward to reading your comments and suggestions. We do take them seriously. So the way we're doing this today is that there will be a speaker for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation Q&A that's done totally through the chat function. So, and I will monitor the chat and then put together coherent questions, hopefully. And we ask everybody to stay muted at all times. And people have asked us repeatedly to organize more webinars around mental health issues. And so I'm very pleased to present a webinar with Dr. Lara Sheehi titled Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. I heard her speak, I think it was last year, and was so excited by her thoughts and her analysis and was very impressed. And she's going to talk about the work of mental health clinicians in Palestine and highlight the ways in which their practice forges spaces of resistance. And as she says, most importantly, living under a brutal settler colonial conditions. As you can see, this webinar is being recorded and will be on our website and on social media. So Lara is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the George Washington University's professional psychology program. She teaches decolonial, liberatory, and anti-oppressive theories and approaches to clinical treatment, case conceptualization, and community consultation. She's the secretary and president-elect of the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology, and the chair of the Teachers Academy of the American Psychoanalytic Association. She's co-editor of Studies in Gender and Sexuality, co-editor of Counterspace in Psychoanalysis, Culture, and Society, and on the editorial board of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Lara is on the advisory board of the USA Palestine Mental Health Network, a group that we work with closely, and co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. So for those who have joined late, as the presentation goes on and during the Q&A conversation, please write your questions in the chat box. For those of you who at this point in the pandemic have avoided figuring out the chat box, it is at the bottom of your screen. You hover on it, click on it. Be sure you're directing your message to everyone and type your question, and I will be looking at all of those. And if you have comments or questions after the webinar or things you think we could improve or whatever, please fill out the survey and be sure you identify yourself so we can reach out to you to converse further. So Lara, why don't you take it away? And I think, I don't think that the speaker's name is in the primary view at this point. I don't think that's been fixed, but go for it.
All right. Hi everybody. يا أهلا وسهلا بالجميع ويا ألف أهلا وسهلا. I'm putting myself on gallery. يا ألف أهلا وسهلا برفاقي وبإخواتي اللي معي اليوم من البلاد العربية وخصوصي اللي من فلسطين المحتلة. Thank you to everyone for being here, and a special thank you, of course, to Alice, whose work I followed for many years. So it's a special treat to be able to be here tonight. And then, of course, to Rachel and Blake for the labor that goes into making these things happen. Everybody behind the scenes, of course, JVP's Healthcare Advisory Council, and really all of JVP who are on the front lines doing the good and necessary work, pushing beyond liberal understandings of what Palestinian liberation is. So my thank you to you all. And of course, I could not present about our book without a special thank you to my writing and life partner and my comrade, Stephen Sheehi. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'm speaking to you from the stolen land of the Pamunkey people, an act of acknowledgement that's merely a starting point for the land back efforts that mental health organizations and practitioners must be a part of as a prerequisite for all forms of liberation, and if we claim to take any liberation praxis seriously. The reason for this starting point tonight, yes, but also in daily practice as mental health clinicians, is such that we can maintain an unbending focus on material reality, on the politics of indigeneity and sovereignty, and important to us, our own role and ethical imperative in centering these struggles in our thinking and praxis about mental health well-being. This departure point is central to our book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. That is, in centering the labor struggles and especially the world and life-making efforts of our Palestinian colleagues, we join them in resisting settler colonial logics that rely on reality bending, dialogue efforts that fundamentally subjugate Palestinians, and psychological and psychic disavowals that allow harm to be enacted under the guise of mental health help. This is what we call in the book psychoanalytic innocence. And this innocence, of course, also takes many forms and has many arms. A land acknowledgement, as I've done tonight, if it is backed by a political coherence of its real world implications and logical extensions, can be a part of, importantly, lending our clinical and professional voices and labor to the struggle for Indigenous sovereignty, whether that's in Palestine or here in Turtle Island. As in our book, it's a starting point that insists on reclaiming psychic disavowals that work in concert with state structures and violence, especially in the apartheid settler colonial apparatus of the state now known as Israel. Tonight, my talk is about Palestine, and there's a specificity and an urgency to Palestine for us mental health workers. There's an urgency to attending to the daily attacks on life, the insistence on settler sovereignty over Indigenous self-determination, which is a central psychic mechanic of settler colonial logics. There's an immediate danger to the destruction of places like Masafriata, to Silwan, to Sheikh Jarrah, to Nablus, to Khalil. A danger to queer folks whose plight is pinkwashed by the occupation. A palpable and screaming violence done onto children who, in Nadir Sharhoub Kavrkian's words, are unchilded, but who still defy the state. There's also an urgency to the brutality of the carceral regime that holds a child like Ahmad Manasra, largely in solitary confinement since he was 13 years old. All of this is urgent and can seem impenetrable. And yet, the part of the work that our book clearly defines are the ways that Palestinian mental health workers defy these oppressive structures, insist on their willfulness, and go beyond the trite contours of Eurocentric understandings of trauma and victimhood. Our work instead highlights and uplifts life, life-making, and life-giving, in spite of the chokeholds, as Jaspir Puar might call them, that the state now known as Israel operationalizes and mechanizes with impunity. That said, as we speak of Palestine, as we came upon time and again in our work there, and when Palestinian clinicians call on us to heed their call of urgency, I want to remind us also that we are clear about how global struggles for liberation are inextricably linked, especially in this current sociopolitical condition. So when I talk about liberation struggles, I'm talking about Black liberation, I'm talking about Latinx liberation, I'm talking about trans liberation, disabled liberation, and all Indigenous liberation. These crevices should be our overlapping points of struggle in the clinic as readily as in the street, in a matrix where, as Robin D.G. Kelly reminds us, solidarity is not a market exchange. This is my own urgent call to the clinicians among us tonight, especially. As you listen to the labor being done on the ground in Palestine, listen also to those in diaspora, in exile, as connected and linked up with landed Palestine, all of landed Palestine, across the land, from the river to the sea. In this way, it becomes clear. We must stand in solidarity with all liberation efforts. We must follow the lead of our Palestinian colleagues. We must center Palestine in every effort, and we must bravely support boycott, divestment, and sanction efforts despite threats and efforts to derail solidarity. For me, this needs to be done not as an offshoot of our clinical work or a distraction, but rather a central working tenet of any clinical praxis that purports to be interested in alleviating the suffering of others. This is a moment for us to lean into what is often called a split, to resist and disrupt efforts to constrict our solidarity through civilizational enticements, to refuse calls at dialogue that by now are clearly stacked in the favor of the oppressor and have always been in service of colonial hegemony and futures. I will come back to this point, but for now, let's go to Palestine and to our Palestinian colleagues who so generously gave of themselves, of their lives and practice, and of their thoughts and affect when Stephen and myself worked alongside them in preparing our book. My talk, like our book, uplifts the work being done on the ground in Palestine, work that has been happening for decades, but has only recently gotten the sustained attention it deserves from those in the global north. And then I'll bring it back to us as in the global north, us as in non-Palestinian us as in the clinical us. I will bring it back to what we must do if we're serious about Palestinian liberation. And I'll bring it back to how supporting Indigenous self-determination is an ethical imperative of our practice. I'm really hopeful we'll have plenty of time for questions, so please do ask, no matter how big or small. The magnitude of the liberatory work being done in Palestine by righteous Palestinian comrades and colleagues is hard to capture in a short time frame, but I'll offer you some thoughts that I hope will begin to sketch what I started with, that we must center, not just include, but center Palestine in our struggle for liberation. Palestine as a central space and place of liberatory potential, a feminist stronghold, an anti-capitalist and abolitionist space of materiality, and as my partner and co-author Stephen Sheehi says, a site of the decolonial now. So we're so often caught up with what comes later, we might overlook what is happening now in the moment, right as we speak. Our book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, takes up these following points specifically to provide an overview of this incredible work being done in Palestine by our colleagues. So to start with, we sketch out and learn from our Palestinian colleagues about the work they're doing towards disalienation, which comes from Frantz Fanon and the likes of Martin Barro, talking about the ways in which our clinician friends sustain disalienation resist being seduced into colonial logics that alienate them further and might dismember them from their collective and individual processes and communities. They do this both in the clinic and on the street, so to speak, collapsing this barrier that is set between clinical space and communal praxis and also political process. And in many ways, this is where the work and the meat and the texture of the importance of not succumbing to misleading claims of splitting, where we hear again and again, if you are engaged both in the clinic and on the street, then you might be somebody who's splitting, taking a stance, actually making your political stance known. And our Palestinian colleagues, in working towards disalienation, refuse that characterization and refuse, again, the misleading claims that somehow that's splitting. The other part of what our Palestinian colleagues consistently show us are the ways in which they excavate life and livability. And I'm so thankful to Alice that you highlighted that from the beginning, because I think if there's anything that sort of comes forward, it's the fact that despite continuous processes of oppression and asphyxiation, an asphyxiatory regime of settler colonial logics, that life and living are a central piece of working as mental health clinicians. And here we can think about it instead of dissociating. We often hear in regular parlance of trauma, or sort of Eurocentric views about trauma, and over-reliance on ideas about dissociating. What our Palestinian colleagues show us time and again is their efforts and their commitment to reassociating, to relink, to remain linked up in the communal and social processes that undergird Palestinian society and undergird life and living efforts, despite all efforts otherwise by the state now known as Israel. Further, our Palestinian colleagues show us that Palestinian clinical practice is in a constant battle to work to personal and collective disalienation under settler colonialism. So this idea of this being disalienated has to link up with the struggle against settler colonialism. And in doing so, they move beyond recognizing this battle against settler colonialism as merely a symptom, right? But rather as a condition, not an essential failure of Palestinians, but rather what's brought home so beautifully is that settler colonialism produces that conflict, not a psychoanalytic one, but one which forecloses possibilities of being. Right? And that is what our colleagues are constantly in conflict around, pushing past what otherwise would be foreclosed possibilities of what life looks like, what struggle looks like, what living looks like. And in doing so, they mark what the real symptom is, what the real import is, and that is a settler colonial regime. In doing so, also, our Palestinian colleagues consistently depathologize and remind us to depathologize the will to live and be liberated. And this is especially powerful as so often we can sort of trace this in our theories, in our praxis, how the will to be alive, to live and be liberated in one's own ancestral homeland becomes pathological in and of itself. In here, our Palestinian colleagues remind us that the will to live as a Palestinian includes the will to live as a willful Palestinian, as a Palestinian that maintains and sustains agency in the face of oppressive forces. It's not a legibility that is called upon by our field or by settler colonialism or by the structures of training or clinical practice that calls them into being in a particular type of subjectivity, but rather a willful Palestinian subjectivity that is chosen and enacted and reenacted every day by our colleagues. Another part of this depathologization and understanding Palestinians as willful subjects, and here I'm borrowing this idea of willful subjects from Sarah Ahmad, is also to understand the ways in which Palestinians are invited and often conscripted to collaborate with certain forms of humanism that psychoanalysis, especially, which is the focus of our book, presents as universal and apolitical or beyond politics. So rather than sort of the willful being, what oftentimes happens is in providing psychoanalytic services, the psychoanalytic services that are done not by our Palestinian colleagues, there's often an ask of our Palestinian colleagues that there's a prerequisite to becoming legible as a particular type of clinician, as a competent clinician, or as what we might call a good Arab. And I'm using Arab specifically because we also know that in the state now known as Israel, you cannot refer to yourself as a Palestinian. You cannot have the word Palestine in a formal organization, for example. So that's why it's in quotes. But in being invited into being a good Arab versus a willful Palestinian, there's also ways in which there's a demand for conscription, a demand to collaborate, a demand to show up in certain ways that fit our ideas about civilizational discourses, for example. And the way that we see that psychoanalysis or mental health practice links up with this is there's a certain focus on a type of humanism that, again, is universal, but also apolitical. It's defanged from its politics. And our understanding is that this is not accidental, that in fact, because of what we were talking about psychoanalytic innocence, it links up with the settler colonial regime and the violence of the state that becomes constitutive of psychoanalytic theory and practice as it stands currently, right? And so this comes from a conversation also that we had with our friend and colleague, Nandira Sharhoub-Kavrkian, who noted that the title of our book is Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. And she said, it's actually psychoanalysis that's under occupation. It's not Palestinians that are under occupation in this regard. And this is what we would call the sort of working tenets together when these things link up, mental health practice and the state in a very particular framework. We would call this is what I was referring to earlier as psychoanalytic innocence. The other thing that we learned throughout our work alongside our colleagues was how the work of Palestinian clinicians may from the outside seem disaggregated throughout Palestine, but that is a myth that is implanted and overlaid by an Israeli settler colonial logic that works to have us understand Palestine as fragmented, right? So again, the efforts themselves might appear to be fragmented, that parallels a settler colonial logic that presents Palestine as fragmented. However, in our interaction with Palestinian clinicians throughout historic Palestine, we've realized it's their practice individually and collectively that forms the backbone of a material reality and fact that Palestine is not only real, but present and also united. And this, we call this in the books, psychotherapeutic commons. The Palestine Global Mental Health Network is a piece of this. Cesar Hakim's clinic in Bethlehem is a piece of this. The Palestine Counseling Center in Ramallah and Quds and other places that Rana Nashashibi leads is a piece of this. And so many other wonderful clinics teamed up across what appears to be a fragmented Palestine to make interwoven and linked up psychotherapeutic commons that has been alive and generative and providing care and support and containment to all Palestinians. And of course, I can't forget the Gaza mental health program that is head up by Yasser al-Jami'i as well. In this way, in interrupting the political conditions, in insisting on a united Palestine, despite the fragmentation of settler colonialism and the overlay of an apartheid regime, the social relations of settler colonialism under which Palestinian clinicians live, there's an articulation, a very clear articulation, an unbending articulation of healthy subjectivity and practices that shore up Palestinian identity, an identity that is inextricable to their lives and their claim to Palestine and the land. And here I want to sort of look at Palestinian identity as constituted by what we might call the nefes, which is the soul, the psyche, the breath, and the self, all at once, unified in health, despite the conditions under which our Palestinian colleagues live. This health, this unification, this fortified selfhood is also why it must be silenced. So what we see in a sort of willfulness of subjectivity and selfhood is a reaction that matches the power of that nefes. This is why it must be silenced. So time and again, we hear stories of our clinician colleagues, particularly those who are in training, whose supervisors, Israeli Jewish supervisors, attempt to not only silence them as clinicians, but silence their patients as speaking subjects. And what emerged from this recognition, this sort of pattern that we saw across the board, is that if a Palestinian patient were to speak, then and to be taken in as a speaking subject, then they might speak the realities and the material conditions that are undeniable to Palestinians across Palestine, but that are disavowed on the regular by Israeli Jewish clinicians. In speaking truth to these material realities, in linking up across historic Palestine, in insisting on a willfulness, our Palestinian colleagues showed us time and again how they disrupt settler colonial legitimacy and defy settler colonial enclosures to share and create knowledge across Palestine, an indigenous Palestinian knowledge that spans all of Palestine despite the disruptions. And in this way, I'm borrowing here from Ian Parker, a clinician in the UK, who would talk about disrupting narcissistic authoritarianism, and of course, disrupting the process of what he calls wiping away history. Our focus then on the work of clinicians in Palestine comes from decades of thought, research, and struggle in our respective fields and in conversation with folks on the ground in Palestine. For me as a clinician, Palestine and my Palestinian colleagues helped me realign with ethical imperatives of clinical work as I was invited into a new depth of knowledge relating to the disjuncture of theory and praxis that I had seen time and again, especially in the global north. In centering Palestine and our colleagues there, I'm interested in challenging and pushing our field to deliver on the promises it has made and to continue the revolutionary and liberatory work of those like Frantz Fanon and others who came before us. In many ways, really, as in Palestine, perhaps we should always start with Fanon as an entry point to any liberatory work we do. So rather than begin with Freud, we begin with Fanon, a process of disrupting the normativity of the field and also the coloniality of power and epistemological exclusion, as Urmi Tapa Duta notes. So who is left out of knowledge? Who is left out of history? Who creates and maintains knowledge and knowledge production, and who doesn't? To do this type of work, we can't be afraid of non-negotiable truths of history. Tonight, I want to share what was only confirmed and fortified through the community building that Stephen and I did for our book in Palestine. My non-negotiable starting point is this: an ethical and attuned clinical practice in the settler colonial condition, whether in Palestine or in Turtle Island, cannot happen without an ideological shift in the theoretical and technical basis of how we function as clinicians and as mental health practitioners. This shift necessarily includes locating our own selves as clinicians, as practitioners, as helpers, but also as a whole profession within a sociopolitical history that accounts for intersectional experience within oppressive systems. What this means is that we cannot escape our own complicity in sustaining oppressive systems, regardless of our belief in whatever helping profession we happen to be a part of. This reclamation of non-negotiable truths is deeply important work because psychology, and by extension psychoanalysis, and of course psychiatry, especially when practiced in a settler or settler colonial framework and without analyzing the systemic elements at play, works to, by design, dislocate, dismember, atomize, and displace us as practitioners, as well as the struggles and challenges folks bring to us. In this way, if we practice without this reclamation of non-negotiable truths, without reclaiming the disavowal, we might miss entirely what our Palestinian clinician comrades always alert us to, that it's settler colonialism that's the problem. It's racial capitalism that's the problem. It's patriarchy, it's transphobia, and so on. This and these structures are what constitute the site of suffering, rather than an individual lack that we can somehow omnipotently relieve in the confines of a clinic. More specifically, this dismembered work always underscores a refocus on the individual encounter. But the individual encounter falls on fault lines that work in service of capitalism, of neoliberal subjectivity, and of course, in service of imperial power, which is so important if we are located and practicing in the context of the settler colony of the United States, but also its proxies in other settler colonial conditions in the world. And mainly, this is how, of course, we shore up systems of power, including the centrality of the United States. And also, I'm thinking about the wrecking effects that we see of the human on the non-human in these climate catastrophes that we're seeing every single day, our rising, of course, temperatures. Everything that's happened globally right now is intimately linked in with these structures of oppression that we're implicated in as clinicians. More so, if we're not looking at the ways in which these structures work, just as our Palestinian colleagues remind us, we have the ability to rather locate the problem within the individual and displace sociopolitical history and reality. And this displacement muddles the root cause of what Indigenous scholars like Ghana and Braveheart Yellowhorse call racial traumas. This type of dislocated work shores up these foreclosed possibilities we were talking about, the ones that our Palestinian colleagues work tirelessly against, especially with regard to what constitutes health and wellness and how we even conceive of things like ability and debility. And again, here I'm thinking of just Pierre Poire's work. Most destructively, if we're not attentive to these structures and instead focus on the individual, we disavow the complicity that we have in people's suffering. This is something that my mentor and friend Lynn Layton calls our attention to. And instead, we are more likely to think about all the suffering happening out there, right? Rather than happening also in our clinics or in the ways that we might link up or not link up with struggles of liberation, especially in Palestine. If, like our Palestinian colleagues, we apprehend the violence enacted under these conditions, especially settler colonial conditions, our ethical imperative as clinicians must be to see the connections between physical and psychic boundaries and their violations, as well as the rights of those whose relationship to confinement, space, and movement are dictated by oppressors, colonial and otherwise. Here, of course, the most obvious is Palestine, right? Palestine chock full of checkpoints and surveillance and funerals being attacked, of 12 and 13 and 14-year-old kids being detained without leave legally. But also in bringing it back to our interconnectedness of our struggles, I want to also think about poverty and COVID-19 and so on. I will end on this note so that we can turn to Q&A. Almost 10 years ago, I wrote a manifesto, and it was called "The Road to Psychoanalysis Runs Through Jerusalem." This has never been more true than today, as we witness both the site of violence in Al-Quds, in Jerusalem, in Nablus, and other places in Palestine. But also, it's never been more true because these are also the sites of life and life force. At the time in the manifesto, I said, liberate Palestine with psychoanalysis. I meant it then, but I was also taking a deliberate stance, still saturated with relationality to normative clinical praxis. Today, my stance is slightly different, but no less militant. And here's where I would say that liberation is our struggle. And when I'm saying our, I'm talking specifically to mental health practitioners, but I'm also relating what our clinical colleagues in Palestine work on and work for every single day. Liberation is our struggle. Palestine and Jerusalem's and the Palestinian people are the center. Psychoanalysis, psychology, psychiatry, social work, and all the helping professionals can come along. They can be one of many tools that we use towards liberation, but they themselves cannot be the site of liberation, as our colleagues in Palestine show us over and over again. The site of liberation is Palestine. It's the Palestinian people, and we must join them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that overview and analysis. I was wondering if I could ask you to think about, what is mental healthiness and what is mental pathology under occupation? How can you be healthy in an unhealthy environment? And I'm wondering if you could speak, very on the ground clinical examples, experiences with patients, experiences with Palestinian clinicians, like
Sure.
Take it from the intellectual framework and make it real for those of us on this Zoom.
Sure. Thank you, Alice. I really appreciate that. So I think it's a leading question that I love in some ways. Can somebody be healthy under occupation? The easy answer is no, but what we see time and time again is yes, right? Despite or in spite of the occupation. And I think this is why calls for BDS, for example, are really important, because what calls for BDS do is say, can we lend our weight to the processes and the networks and the linking up on the ground that Palestinian clinicians are due to insist on health, despite the pressures put upon them, right? I'll give you an example of this because you asked for example. One of the most sort of framing examples we came up against was shared by our colleague Youad Ghnadri Hakim, which I've spoken about and been asked to present in several instances, I think because it sticks with people in really real ways. And the case itself is not the focus of our work. Our book, in fact, very rarely goes into the cases themselves, but rather highlights the work of clinicians as they have told us about their cases. The most, I think, sort of liberating and exhilarating parts of this particular case is when Youad is treating a patient of hers who over and over again is read by her Jewish Israeli psychoanalyst supervisor, right? And this is really important because the supervisor was psychoanalytic. Every time Yoad would bring this case in, the supervisor would read the case and offer purely behavioral interventions, right? And every time Yoad would say, but actually I'm having this countertransference, or I'm feeling this sort of way towards the patient, or actually this idea of he would struggle from a ball in his throat and wouldn't be able to speak. And Yoad, because she's trained psychoanalytically, would say, I think there's meaning to this symptom. This symptom of being stopped up might represent being choked up, all these sorts of things, which many of us clinicians here can be like, well, that's a direct link. What we saw instead was what we might call unconscious, if we're not thinking about psychoanalytic innocence. There's nothing unconscious about in a situation when there's a sort of disparity of power, where a clinician who otherwise would see any other patient psychoanalytically, suddenly with a Palestinian patient, seeing him only as a behavioral being without any interiority. And so over and over again, we hear these stories of supervisors stopping up the speaking of the patient and then stopping up the speaking of the clinician about what are the actual material conditions that the patients are bringing in. In this particular case, right as the patient starts to speak, Yoad told us that the supervisor says it's time to terminate treatment, just as the work is starting to be done. Yoad, being a supervisee, goes back to the patient and says, we need to end treatment. And the patient has the first outburst he's ever had and says, you are not the one who holds the decision-making power here. And you are not, if you do this, you are not interested in the health and well-being of patients. And that's back to the question of what constitutes health. Now, in a Eurocentric framework, and perhaps in a purely patriarchal framework, we can read that outburst as being a lack of anger management, a sort of inability to function, inability to hold, maintain or properly work through affect. But what Yoad saw, because she lived in the same world this Palestinian patient did, she told us that in that moment, she felt the most joy because the ball had not stopped up the affect. And in fact, he was right, that in taking the orders of a supervisor who's directly implicated with the state, right, but through licensing, through all of that in fact, she was doing more harm than good, because it was being read as a purely behavioral process. So she tells us that this case that will stay with her forever is one that she says, I decided to continue treatment anyway, right? Again, those of us trained might be like, whoa, that's an unethical move. You continue treatment without supervision. But this is the place where I want to bring our attention to, is our energy goes to that as being unethical, rather than as the settler colonial condition being unethical. And that the only way for liberatory process is for Yoad to actually refuse to be an agent of the state in that regard, right? That's one of many examples. Another example I can provide is our friend and colleague in Bethlehem, Cesar Hakim, who had a patient that actually opens up the book. Our first chapter opens up this book with this patient who at one point they were sitting in the room together and tear gas pours into the room, right? And in many ways, I think this is part of like our efforts to separate the clinic from the street might not really work in a situation when tear gas is coming into the room. And yet, one of the most powerful things that he provides us is that the overdetermination of the settler colonial condition as being responsible for all her problems was also not a space that he took up. And in doing, he provided a space for this Palestinian woman to also take up agency. She wasn't just a victim of the colonial condition. She was very much a speaking subject. She was very much a desiring subject. She was a woman with desires and complexity and interiority that was also in conversation with a Palestinian man who made space for her. So there was no place in which he came in and said, there's no such thing as patriarchy in Palestine. What he did say, though, is settler colonialism actually works in concert with patriarchy, so that the symptoms are hard to maybe sort of take apart. And also we know that systems of oppression work very well together, right? So those are just a couple examples. I have so many more, but I will.
Okay, so that's helps to understand the on-the-ground reality. I have a comment and a question here. It says, the analysis you present of the situation and the predicament of inhabitants and clinicians is highly developed and extremely sophisticated. How does the clinical engagement unfold when the person presenting their suffering has not acquired such a perspective? Does the clinician's role include an explicit political education, or is the liberatory experience transmitted in the relationship? So we're looking for what happens on the ground. Forget all the theoretical, we've got that, but what happens in the room?
Yes.
Clinician, patient, anxiety, depression, panic, which may all be totally appropriate for the moment, but yes, what do you do?
Yes. Okay. So, I mean, I think I love that there's a relational piece. I think it's both, right? Is there an explicit political position? There always is. Whether or not we speak about it, there always is a explicit political position we're taking. And so that was my invitation to clinicians to be like, don't worry about these non-negotiable truths. If you are in Palestine, or if you are working with a Palestinian, mentioning the settler colonial condition is not imposing anything. You are not taking a side. You are just describing reality, right? And in that way, perhaps, yes, we can say that is a political position, and it's one that makes us unlearn all the things, all the lies, I would say, that our practices and our professions and our fields told us. Much like in sort of, in a medical condition, we would think about somehow like, we'd imagine that poverty doesn't affect people's well-being, right? If we mention, hey, actually being in food deserts might make it a little hard for you to get the nutrition that you need, right? It's the same sort of position. How does it come through? Yes, of course, it's through the relational space, right? So number one, it's about being attentive to both the individual and the collective at the same time. We're not losing the individual when we're focusing on the structures that might sort of read that individual in a particular way, right? So Yoad's patient, not of anything of his doing, walks in, and the supervisor has already taken a political position. She sees him as inferior. She sees him as inferior, not because of his own doing or a lack in him, but because the power structures and where they are located positions her to see that, right? So in many ways, yes, of course, there's an acknowledgement of conditions, right? Working with somebody, for example, working with folks in the United States who are racialized Black folks, an acknowledgement of racism on an everyday basis is nothing new. It's not a new concept to somebody coming in. So yeah, absolutely, we might say something like, these are the wrecking effects, what Dorothy Holmes might say are the wrecking effects of racism. How that materializes for every person in very specific ways might be a whole other conversation, right? And in that way, in the relational space, something might emerge. And that is, I think, part of what we might think about the liberatory perspective is the disalienation, the idea that we are constantly having to remind ourselves that the conditions we live in are what are abnormal. It's not us. It's the conditions. This is why I bring in capitalism. This is why I bring in climate tech. Those conditions are not natural, right? Our responses to them are markers of that unnatural process. And so but what that means to every person, what the meaning making they make of, how that ties into patterns that they might have experienced in their own life, in their gender expression, in the way that people interact with them, that has a personal meaning. So that's why my answer is both and.
Okay. And there's a question, how to address the deliberate and systemic traumatization on the part of the oppressors directed at the individual, but especially to the collective. I think, again, people want to know on the ground how do you do this?
Yes. So are we talking clinically, or are we talking about what we should do, like an actual treatment or clinical?
Why don't you do an actual treatment? Because I think there's the intellectual framework, and it would be nice to have, well, the questionnaire wants both. So
okay, both. Okay. So one thing's first. So I will give you an example from my own clinical practice. It's a sort of sustained attention also to the conditions. That means how we practice and how we set up our practice to begin with, which includes fee structure. So my own, again, learning with Palestinians on the ground, what constitutes clinical work and how we think about it and what is up for grabs. That's the answer. Like, what is up for grabs for us to think about, really reconsider, and really imagine something new. This is what is decolonial about us. Imagine something new. Really helped me to think about, okay, what type of practice do I want to do? And this gets at the conditions. How do you address the systemic conditions? The systemic condition that I'm going to give you an example about is wealth inequality, right? Or historical, a sort of historical inability to access mental health services. In my thinking about that, I realized that the way I was taught to practice is not sustainable, or does not match up, or is not reconcilable with this element of addressing wealth inequality. So with colleagues across the world, we started to think about what are ways to practice differently, meaning how do we reimagine the private clinic? How do we reimagine private practice? What I have fallen upon, this is just one example, is what I would call a communally based practice, a cooperatively owned practice. I happen to be a solo practitioner. So how do I think about that by myself? The way that number one is I mark myself as political immediately. I tell patients in my write-up or my bio that I'm political, that I think about capitalism, that I think about imperialism, that I think about structures as having effects on us, our relationships, our emotions. So up front, I'm already letting people know this is my angle, right? And a lot of times people will be like, but isn't that sort of foreclosing other people to come see you? And my answer is oftentimes, there are a lot of people who don't practice this way. There are a lot of options, but the number of people that write me and say, are there radical sort of leftist people, anti-capitalist practitioners? So that's number one. Then I had to look at my fee structure and how does that align with reconciling wealth inequality? And so the way that I sort of configured it was to say, here's my top fee. And every time I have somebody come in, I talk to them and I say, my practice is communal. I'm the main person between you all. You might never meet each other, but the practice is communal such that everybody is responsible for distributing care. So here's the top fee you could pay. And the way that I want you to decide on what fee you will pay is for you to consider what would allow you to see me weekly in therapy that wouldn't make you have to trade off something else that's life-sustaining, meaning a meal with friends or good produce. Nobody should have to choose between that and mental health care. And so folks set their fee based on the idea of that. And what I also say is, the more you have, the more you'll underwrite somebody else in my practice that doesn't have. And so that is just one example of just reimagining what we could potentially do and how we might think about it. That the question, and I see that as a clinical question. It's not just an admin question. It's a clinical question of who we present ourselves as clinicians and how we think about everything being linked up in these particular ways. I'm also working on currently on a technique book that takes sort of proclamations that we might make in the field and say, what would that mean if we extended it to its radical end? What does it mean if we're truly dedicated to people's autonomy? And this feels especially important in our current environment right now, when reproductive rights are under attack, when trans kids are being willfully sort of stopped from becoming trans adults. What does that mean when we talk about autonomy? And what does that mean technically when we say, okay, to its logical end, it goes back to what you're saying, Alice, about, or the question being like, do you take a political position? In many ways, yeah, if we're serious about autonomy, if we're serious about health and wellness being wrapped up with people's alignment with their fullness of their self, then there's no way but not to take a position about these things.
Okay, that's great. I think this is going to be the last question. I think it would be helpful for people to understand in Israel, Palestine, or however we're going to call this place, what is the structure of mental health care, and how do mental health workers get trained both in Israel and in Palestine and certified, and how do patients get to help, and how does that all work? Because that's part, as you're saying, that's part of the treatment, is the structure.
Yes. Yes, that's a great question. So the most immediate answer is it depends on where folks live. And I say that very specifically because in especially in an apartheid situation, where folks live dictates what type of access they have and where they can freely move, if at all. Right. So that's not just like a pedantic point. That is a central point of how things are set up. If folks are within the state now known as Israel, so I would talk about the 1948 borders of the state now known as Israel, there's a particular licensing board that folks go through. They have to go through a institution that is in the state now known as Israel, go through all education in Hebrew, sit for a licensing exam in Hebrew. The board consists of Israeli Jewish practitioners, and Palestinian folks have to speak Hebrew at that level to be able to pass these board exams and become licensed as a clinician. Prior to that, much like in the context of the United States or in Canada or other places, there's a significant amount of hours that have to be amassed under supervision to be able to make it to that stage. What we heard time and time again is that it's no wonder that there are quite a few, but that there aren't many Palestinian clinical psychologists within the state, because many of them refuse to endure the abuses, the racism, the sort of self-effacement that is involved in being trained in spaces, in these spaces under a state apparatus.
Yeah, you talked about being trained in a house that was a Palestinian home that people got expelled, and there was a training session in the home.
Exactly. Yeah. And that happens very often. Or CEUs, right? Continuing education is necessary. And what we know from our colleagues in the Global Palestine Mental Health Network is that one of these CEU trainings was done in a settlement, in an illegal settlement. And part of continuing their licensure is having to go and sit in these settlements. And so there's all these sorts of constant abuses that happen, or being trained in a stolen home in Jerusalem across the street from Edward Said's home. And Israelis have no idea whose home that is, but Palestinians know that is Edward Said's home, right? So there's all this sort of like double consciousness that's asked of people to engage in, to be like, I am supposed to be trained in a humane clinical practice. These folks think that they're sort of embodying knowledge and practice and humanity, but we are practicing in a stolen home across the street from another. So in fact, we are surrounded by stolen homes in Palestine, regardless of where we are. It's Palestine, right? What is wonderful over the years is for example, there's a training clinic, Mana Center in Nazareth, that is headed by our colleagues Najla Al-Asmar and Mustafa Qassoqsi, and it's the first training site in Arabic supervised by Arabic-speaking Palestinians who have settler colonial citizenship. It's the first of its kind, and it's the first time that clinicians are saying, wow, I'm tasked to see Palestinian patients. I speak in Arabic, but I don't have to back translate into Hebrew to my Israeli supervisor and then translate again for my notes and for my patients. Those of us who are clinicians might understand the task that is involved with doing that, what gets lost in translation. And of course, because of things like the law about who constitutes a full citizen, even within the borders that are now known as Israel, who constitutes a full citizen with full rights, right? Palestinians are always positioned as inferior within that. So there's all these sort of complications within that. Within the West Bank and Gaza, there are different training sites that are available. Of course, it's university-based. Folks go to university. Like most of the world, people can practice with a bachelor's or a master's degree if they have proper supervision and training sites. And so the Palestine Counseling Center, for example, is a central site of training for a lot of clinicians. And our colleagues there also have ways in which they refuse some of the constraints that comes from NGO funding, because 100% mental health funding comes from external sources in the West Bank and Gaza. And there are ways in which they negotiate, okay, what are the things we refuse to do? For example, we refuse to surveil our patients. We refuse to report what is political activity in our patients. And so there are all these ways in which training and supervision is constantly also being negotiated. And I'm using the word very acknowledging what it means in the context of Palestine to say that you constantly have to be in negotiations.
And so patients get, someone has a psychotic break in Hebron, how do they get care versus someone who has a psychotic episode in Haifa? I mean,
yeah. Well, so the insurance, Clalit, for example, is the largest insurance company, and that also includes the mental health aspect of it in the contours of the state now known as Israel. And that Palestinian folks within Haifa, for example, might access their care through there, and also in parts of East Jerusalem as well, might access care there. The issue is that there may not be Palestinian clinicians there. So even patients who are coming to care also most likely have to access their care in Hebrew and may not have people who are sort of attuned to the particularities of what it means to be Palestinian in that context. In the West Bank, there are mental health clinics, of course, and there are the PCC, for example, has satellite spaces across the West Bank, and that might be the way that you access care. Our friend and colleague Fathi Fleifel used to be the head of the Red Crescent, and they had a mental health clinic in Ramallah, which people would just sort of self-refer and show up there. And so there are, it's not unlike the United States, it's just dictated by movement. So somebody in Bethlehem, even though it's a 10-minute, without checkpoints, it might be 10 minutes to get to Jerusalem, cannot access care in Jerusalem, right? Despite the fact that ancestrally, and they have all family members there, and maybe even their family members know really great doctors, 10 minutes away, you are not allowed to go to Jerusalem to get care.
Okay, well, I think we've reached the end of the hour. And, just reflecting on this, I practiced OBGYN as an openly feminist doctor, and it's a similar kind of, you let the patients know your politics, but it's not how you treat their yeast infection, kind of. So I'm relating to it in that kind of way. And I'm sure non-mental health clinicians can also think about how this applies to their particular specialty. So I just want to say to everyone who is on this Zoom webinar, thank you so much for coming. As I mentioned before, we do webinars every 3 months, and the next one is September 18th. We will have 3 organizations who have been designated as terrorist organizations by the Israeli government talking about that impact on human rights and giving us an update. And we also do regular Media Watch publications, monitoring the media on human rights violations. And we've also been keeping a timeline of COVID-19 in the region since the beginning of the pandemic. This is all available on our website, which is jvphealth.org. And you will be happy to know that we're working on updating the website because we know it's very bare bones. And we do other advocacy and writing as well. So I invite everyone to become more active members in Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council. You don't have to be Jewish, you just have to be interested in human rights and health and justice. And please, the sign up is on the website, and do the survey that you will get. And thank you and good night.